So we begin our next section, Romans 9, verse 30, through to Romans 10:17. I've coordinated the options for your translation, possible translations. You can do both, you can do either, any combination you wish, with the pericopes for preaching in various sermon series in Christian worship, A and B. The first is Romans 9:30, 10-4, and the other is Romans 10:13-17. Let's see if I can show this a little bit. Yeah, those would be your two texts for translation. Again, you don't have to do both. You can do just one, but your choice. So let's summarize where we've been so far. Remember, the basic question is, has God been fair to Israel? And God's answer is his sovereign mercy. I have a right to be merciful when I want, and I have a right to be hard and to those who are hard-hearted with me. I will have mercy upon those whom I will have mercy. I will have pity on those whom I will have pity. Verse 16 goes on, so then it is not a matter of the one who wills, nor of the one who runs, but of the mercying God, which we could paraphrase by saying it's not a matter what you want, and it's not a matter of all the effort you put in. It's a matter, your salvation is a matter of when God chooses mercy. Remember, too, that the chapter talked about how God has always been choosing among the chosen. He chose people from both Israel according to the flesh and the Gentiles to belong to his new Israel, the true Israel, the spiritual Israel. He has always been rich in showing mercy. The real question is not why anyone is damned. The question that one should ask when confronted with God's magnificent mercy is, why is anybody saved? It is true that he shows mercy to people who are equally as evil as anybody else. He shows mercy on golden calving Israel, even though they were no better. In fact, one could even argue that they were worse than stubborn Pharaoh. And nevertheless, God chooses to show Israel his mercy. Should the Gentiles then vaunt themselves, and should Israel complain, if God now wants to show mercy in reverse, first of all to the Gentiles, and then after that to the Jews? That's sort of Paul's implied argument. Remember how these chapters really belong together. In mercy, God chose some Jews and some Gentiles to be his people. That's roughly the burden of chapter 9. What's different about chapter 10, the chapter we're about to move into, is that emphasis is on the provision of salvation, how God provided everything that was necessary for both Jew and Gentile through the ministry of the Word. So again, God's gracious provision of righteousness, his gracious provision of salvation, was equally abundant and gracious to both Jew and Gentile, but the Jews, for the most part, rejected the message and its free gift. We can see that there's a slightly different emphasis here because we see, first of all, ti une rumen, which is an indication, a rhetorical question that indicates a switch in subject. And then there are new word chains that occur. The dikaiosune suddenly becomes prominent again, and the idea of pistis. The means of grace are referred to in this section. So God provides everything. The subject matter for the first section we could call the two kinds of righteousness that there are. The one that is by the law, and the other that is the gospel gift, the free gift of righteousness in Christ Jesus. So with that as introduction, let's begin. Ti une rumen, what are we going to say? Gentiles, and here is the paradox of God at work in salvation. When God is active, man can only be passive. When man is active, God cannot help you. So the Gentiles, who did not pursue at all righteousness, they were completely inactive as far as God was concerned. They did not really look for the kind of God that Israel's God was. They did not pursue righteousness. They obtained righteousness, but a righteousness that is not by works, you always have to understand the contrast, but by faith, simply by believing Israel pursued mightily the law that prescribed righteousness, did not attain that legal righteousness. So they strove with might and main to be righteous according to the law. The law was misunderstood, one could say, by them, not in that they followed it mightily as a guide, but that they followed it mightily as a means of salvation. And of course, they couldn't achieve it. It ended up in the hypocrisy that Paul talks about in Romans 2. Why did they fail, Paul says, diati? Because this kind of righteousness, this legal righteousness, is not a matter of faith, but their trying to establish a legal righteousness was on the basis of human works. Faith does not consider itself a work. Faith simply trusts in what God has done. And so they stumbled at the stone of stumbling, just as it is written. And here we see a combination, a conflation, we might say, of two passages from Isaiah, one from chapter 8 and one, I think, from chapter 28. Behold, I set in Zion, right there in the heart of God's people. This is where this stone of offense will appear. This is right where God's people are going to stumble, right in the heart of Zion. It's not going to happen off in some far-off distant place. This stone of salvation is intended to, of course, bring his people home. And so he reveals himself right in Zion. And yet it's right there where people stumble, and it becomes a rock of offense to them. Kai, yet the one who believes upon him will not be put to shame in the judgment. Rather, he will be thoroughly vindicated in the judgment, because he has put his trust in the basis of this stone that the builders rejected. So, any talk of predestination is really introduced by the NIV's rather poor translation, a rock that makes them stumble and a stone that makes them fall. There's no hint of that in the words itself. It could easily be a place where it's a stumbling stone, it's a offense rock, it's a descriptive or a place where people stumble and fall. Which is to say that it all depends not on the law, but on your reaction to Christ. Christ is the inescapable stone, as Martin Franzmann puts it, that sits athwart, that has been placed athwart the pathway of man's destiny, and how an individual responds to it will determine his eternal outcome. So this is not predestination. This is he that believes and is baptized shall be saved. He that believeth not shall be condemned. That's God's decree, that this is the only place of salvation. And that's what God has placed right in the center of God's people. Adelphoi, my dear brothers, and notice how this familial feeling he applies clearly to spiritual Israel. It's not a matter of kinship by flesh, but a kinship by faith. On the one hand, my earnest desire of my heart and my prayer to God. Why would he pray to God over these things if they were damned from all eternity? If they had been predestined to salvation, a prayer would be useless, and yet he still prays for them because he knows it's not inescapable that every single one of them is going to be damned. My prayer to God on their behalf is that they be saved, compressed expression, for salvation, literally. For I bear them witness that a zeal of God they do possess, but not according to a real understanding of the law. So, a good example of someone being passionate about something and yet passionately wrong. We are told to passionately follow our passions. Follow your dreams, even though those dreams may lead us into ditches and valleys where we won't come out of. You can be passionate about something and still be absolutely wrong. And their passion for the law, and he had to bear them witness because he himself was at once passionate about the law and the traditions of the elders. He saw that there were two options. Either you would follow Christ or you would follow the law as a means of salvation. But the two were incompatible. Either you followed Christ and there was the end of the law, or you followed the law and that was an end of Christ. But you couldn't do both. at least not the way the Jews conceived of obedience to the law. So I bear them witness. They're certainly zealous, they're certainly passionate, but they don't have the right understanding. In fact, they disregarded the righteousness that God provided in the gospel, seeking to establish their own righteousness. And because they did that, they did not attain the righteousness of God. I'm translating freely here, but according to sense as much as anything. The righteousness of God, of course, is the gospel righteousness, not the righteousness that God demands, but the righteousness that God gives. Two kinds of righteousness: a righteousness of the law, which is earned through obedience, which is what they were trying to do to achieve their right status before God. And then there's the righteousness which is merely received by faith, a righteousness that has been earned by Christ, a righteousness that God gives in the gospel. They were not subject, they did not subject themselves. How do you subject yourself or submit yourself to a message about a gift? How do you submit and obey a message about a gift? Simply by believing and trusting and receiving it. It's not something that you do, it's the opposite of doing. It's simply trusting. Telos gar nomu Christos eis dikausune panti to pistoionti. For Christ is the culmination of the law, the end point of the law, for righteousness to everyone who believes. Christ is both the place where the law was pointing, foreshadowing, and it was also the place where Jesus fulfilled it. He's not come to destroy, but to fulfill the law and the prophets. He kept every one of its demands perfectly. He suffered all its punishments that it required. And he did this not for himself, but for all who believe, for all who will receive it in faith. Subjective justification is the emphasis here. And that means that as far as God is concerned, the central mediating position of the law is now over. The Old Testament is now over. Christ is the culmination, both the fulfillment and the end point, the terminal point of the law, so that there would be righteousness as a free gift for everyone who believes. I think we've pretty much said all that I can say in this brief introductory exegesis. We'll move on to the next piece later.